The person who meditates daily, posts about gratitude, talks about raising their vibration and manifesting abundance, yet remains deeply unhappy and increasingly isolated from authentic connection, has encountered what John Welwood called spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts and practices to avoid facing unresolved emotional pain, psychological wounds, and developmental work that can't be transcended through positive thinking. Spirituality promises liberation, connection, and peace, but when used defensively, it becomes another mechanism for avoiding difficult feelings, maintaining the illusion of progress while actual healing remains inaccessible. The paradox is that the very practices meant to bring wholeness, meditation, affirmations, energy work, higher consciousness rhetoric, can be weaponized against the parts of yourself that most need attention. Someone insists they've forgiven everyone while seething with unacknowledged resentment. Someone meditates to escape anxiety rather than understand it. Someone focuses exclusively on light and love while their shadow grows more dangerous through neglect. Understanding the dark side of spirituality means recognizing when spiritual practice serves genuine transformation versus when it functions as sophisticated avoidance dressed in sacred language. The patterns show up consistently across contexts. At work, someone adopts spiritual identity as buffer against criticism or accountability, interpreting any negative feedback as others' low vibration or inability to understand their evolved perspective. Colleagues notice the performance doesn't match the proclamations of growth, but attempts to address issues get deflected with language about manifestation, divine timing, or energetic alignment. Projects fail, and instead of examining what went wrong, there's talk about the universe redirecting toward better opportunities. Conflicts with coworkers get framed as others projecting their unhealed trauma rather than as legitimate disagreements. The spiritual framework provides infinite explanations that protect against having to look at actual patterns of behavior that aren't working. In relationships, spiritual bypassing manifests as refusing to engage with conflict, dismissing a partner's legitimate concerns as their unprocessed trauma, while avoiding examination of your own patterns. Everything becomes a lesson the other person needs to learn, while your behavior remains unquestioned because you're on a spiritual path. When a partner expresses hurt, they're told they're choosing to feel hurt, that they're letting ego control them, that a more evolved response would be immediate forgiveness and understanding. Friendships deteriorate as authentic exchange gets replaced with spiritual performance. Every conversation becomes opportunity to demonstrate how awakened you are rather than genuine connection. Friends stop sharing vulnerabilities because they're met with spiritual advice rather than human presence. Someone shares they're struggling, and instead of, "That sounds really hard," they get a lecture about manifestation or choosing different vibrations. The friendship becomes one-directional, with the spiritual person always in teacher role, never vulnerable, never wrong, never simply present without performing wisdom. Social media fills with posts about unconditional love and oneness, while actual relationships feel increasingly hollow and transactional. Someone maintains perfect spiritual persona online while their actual life crumbles privately. The marriage is ending, they're financially unstable, they're deeply lonely, but the image of enlightened peace must be maintained. The gap between image and reality widening until maintaining the facade requires all available energy, leaving nothing for actual healing or connection. The internal experience involves specific contradictions. There's pride in spiritual identity, being someone who meditates, who's conscious, who understands energy and vibration in ways others don't. This identity provides a sense of specialness that compensates for underlying feelings of inadequacy or unworthiness that have never been addressed directly. But there's also growing anxiety about maintaining the image. You can't admit to anger, jealousy, pettiness, or confusion because those emotions are labeled low vibrational. Evidence of insufficient spiritual development. The gap widens between the serene spiritual persona and the actual messy human experience underneath. You find yourself policing your thoughts and feelings, creating internal surveillance state where anything deemed unspiritual gets immediately suppressed. Guilt arises not just from having difficult emotions, but from having them despite all the spiritual work. If you've meditated for years, read all the books, done the practices, attended the retreats, worked with teachers, but still feel anxious, depressed, or unfulfilled, either the teachings are wrong or you're failing at them. And since the teachings are sacred, the failure must be yours. The framework allows no space for the possibility that spiritual practice can coexist with psychological struggle, that meditation doesn't cure trauma, and that positive thinking can't replace actual processing of grief or anger. There's increasing isolation as the split between persona and experience grows. You can't be honest with spiritual community because they'll see you as insufficiently developed. You can't be honest with non-spiritual friends because they wouldn't understand. You end up alone with the dissonance, trying harder at practices that aren't addressing the actual issues, which increases the sense of failure, which increases the pressure to perform spirituality more convincingly. The exhaustion becomes unbearable, but admitting it means facing how much time and energy has gone into a strategy that hasn't produced the promised peace. Spiritual bypassing functions as defense mechanism similar to other psychological defenses. It protects against painful material that feels too threatening to face directly. The adaptive function is clear. If you grew up in an environment where expressing needs or emotions led to punishment or abandonment, developing a spiritual framework that devalues those human experiences makes sense. Claiming you've transcended ego or no longer need validation protects against feeling the pain of never having received it adequately in childhood. Focusing on forgiveness and letting go allows you to avoid acknowledging how hurt or angry you were. Actually are about what was done to you or what you never received. Talking about everything happening for a reason or being a soul lesson helps you avoid feeling powerless or victimized by circumstances that genuinely harmed you through no fault of your own. The spiritual concepts aren't false. Forgiveness, acceptance, and finding meaning in suffering can be part of genuine healing. But when used prematurely, before the actual feelings have been acknowledged and processed, they become barriers to healing rather than pathways toward it. The specific patterns of spiritual bypassing include excessive focus on positive thinking that dismisses or pathologizes difficult emotions as character flaws or spiritual failures. Someone experiences legitimate grief after loss and gets told they're attracting negativity with their low vibration, that they need to choose happiness, that their sadness is keeping them stuck in victim consciousness. Anger gets labeled as unspiritual, ego-based, or evidence of insufficient evolution. The message is that enlightened people don't feel anger, which is both psychologically inaccurate and creates shame around normal human responses to boundary violations and injustice. The result is emotional suppression dressed in spiritual language, with all the same consequences. The emotions don't disappear, they just operate outside conscious awareness in more damaging ways, leaking out as passive aggression, somatic symptoms, or sudden overwhelming eruptions. Premature forgiveness represents another common pattern where someone claims to have forgiven while the actual process of acknowledging hurt, anger, and impact hasn't happened. They've read that forgiveness is spiritually advanced, that holding on to anger hurts only themselves, so they declare forgiveness immediately. But this creates a split. Conscious belief that everything is forgiven, while unconscious resentment leaks out through passive aggression, withdrawal, repeated rehashing of the offense disguised as spiritual processing, or sudden rage that seems to come from nowhere. True forgiveness is a process that typically requires first fully acknowledging the harm, feeling the anger and hurt, grieving what was lost, and only then, sometimes months or years later, arriving at genuine release. Skipping to forgiveness because it seems more spiritual bypasses the necessary stages and creates false healing that doesn't hold. Overemphasis on detachment that becomes dissociation or emotional numbness represents another shadow pattern. Someone learns through meditation or spiritual practice to observe thoughts and feelings without identification, which is genuinely useful skill. But it gets misapplied as constant detachment where nothing touches you, nothing matters, and emotional connection becomes impossible. People around you experience this as coldness, as not being met or seen, as interacting with someone who's checked out. This isn't enlightened non-attachment. It's trauma-responsive shutting down that's been reframed as spiritual achievement. The person feels relief because painful emotions are no longer so acute, but they've also cut themselves off from joy, love, passion, and genuine aliveness. Compassion that lacks boundaries, where being spiritual means tolerating everything, never saying no, allowing yourself to be depleted or harmed because setting limits would be judgmental or unloving. This creates martyrdom, where someone gives endlessly while resenting everyone they're giving to, eventually collapsing into burnout or bitterness, but unable to acknowledge it because their identity depends on being selfless and compassionate. They've confused boundaryless accommodation with love, believing that truly spiritual people don't have needs or limits. When they finally burn out or explode in resentment, they feel like spiritual failures, rather than recognizing they've been practicing unsustainable codependency disguised as compassion. Using spiritual practice to avoid practical life shows up as someone who meditates for hours but can't hold a job, maintain relationships, or handle basic responsibilities. The spiritual practice becomes escape from engagement with actual life rather than support for living more fully. Bills go unpaid while they attend workshops. Relationships deteriorate while they're on retreat. The concrete demands of existence get framed as distractions from spiritual development, rather than the ground where spiritual development either manifests or remains theoretical. Believing you've arrived at higher level of consciousness that exempts you from normal human experience manifests as spiritual narcissism, where someone positions themselves as more evolved than others, interprets any challenge or criticism as others not understanding their elevated state, and uses spiritual concepts to avoid accountability. The ego remains fully intact, but now operates under spiritual disguise, potentially more dangerous because it's harder to recognize and challenge when wrapped in sacred language. The risk of excessive identification with spiritual identity is that it becomes another persona, a mask that's potentially more rigid than conventional identities because it's sanctified. If your sense of worth depends on being spiritual, awakened, or conscious, then anything that threatens that image becomes intolerable. You can't admit to pettiness, confusion, doubt, or regression because those experiences would shatter the identity. This creates pressure to maintain spiritual performance rather than allowing authentic experience. It also creates hierarchy where some emotions and behaviors are acceptable and others get exiled into shadow. The exiled material doesn't disappear, it operates unconsciously, often in ways that directly contradict spiritual values. Someone preaches love and compassion while harboring judgment and superiority. Someone teaches non-attachment while being rigidly attached to their spiritual identity and practices. Someone talks about ego dissolution while their ego inflates through spiritual specialness, through being the one who understands what others don't. The social dynamics of spiritual communities often reinforce bypassing rather than challenging it. Communities develop implicit hierarchies based on who appears most awakened, most positive, most detached from earthly concerns. Members compete through spiritual performance: who meditates longest, who's most forgiving, who can transcend the most difficult circumstances with equanimity, who has the most impressive spiritual experiences to report. Vulnerability becomes interpreted as spiritual failure. If you admit to struggling with depression, anxiety, relationship problems, or practical life challenges, you risk being seen as insufficiently developed, not trying hard enough, attracting negativity through your mindset, or stuck in victim consciousness. This creates pressure to present only the spiritual persona while actual human struggles remain hidden and unaddressed. The community that should provide support for genuine growth instead becomes another context where authenticity feels dangerous and performance is rewarded. Leaders in spiritual spaces sometimes exploit this dynamic deliberately or unconsciously. A teacher or guru positions themselves as enlightened, using that status to avoid accountability for harmful behavior. Students are told that their discomfort with the teacher's actions, boundary violations, financial exploitation, sexual misconduct, reflects their own unprocessed issues rather than legitimate concern about abuse. The spiritual framework gets weaponized. Questioning the teacher becomes ego, having boundaries becomes lack of surrender, and expressing hurt becomes evidence of insufficient spiritual development. This creates an environment where abuse can flourish under guise of spiritual teaching, with victims gaslit into believing their accurate perceptions are spiritual failures. The power differential inherent in teacher-student relationships gets magnified when combined with belief that the teacher has access to higher truth that students can't yet perceive. Micro-scenarios illustrate these patterns concretely. Someone shares with their spiritual community that they're struggling with depression, that medication isn't working well, that they feel hopeless. Instead of acknowledging the pain and suggesting practical support like finding a good therapist or psychiatrist, they're told to raise their vibration through gratitude practice, focus on positive thoughts, remember they chose this struggle before incarnating as a soul lesson. The actual suffering gets invalidated, while responsibility for fixing it through positive thinking gets placed entirely on the sufferer, who now feels worse because they're failing at both being happy and being spiritual. In a conflict between partners, one person uses spiritual language to avoid accountability. They didn't lie about spending joint savings, they were honoring their truth. They didn't break an agreement about monogamy, they were following their intuition and staying open to universal flow. Any attempt by the partner to address the actual harm gets reframed as the partner being stuck in ego, unable to understand spiritual principles, or trying to control them through fear-based attachment. Someone experiences sexual assault and begins processing it in trauma therapy. Their spiritual community suggests they should be able to transcend it through meditation, that therapy keeps them focused on victim consciousness and prevents healing, that true healing comes from immediate forgiveness and releasing attachment to the story. The person feels torn between the actual healing work happening in therapy and maintaining belonging in community that pathologizes that work as unspiritual. They're told their continued distress months later means they're choosing to stay stuck, that they manifested the assault through past life karma or low vibration, that an enlightened response would be instant forgiveness and gratitude for the lesson. This represents bypassing at its most harmful, invalidating genuine trauma while burdening the victim with responsibility for both the event and their natural response to it. Working with this material requires distinguishing between genuine spiritual practice and spiritual bypassing, recognizing they can look identical from outside but feel completely different internally. Genuine practice involves moving toward difficult material rather than away from it. Meditation that helps you notice and stay with anxiety, understanding it more deeply, rather than meditation used to escape anxiety or achieve a state where anxiety isn't present. Forgiveness that happens after fully processing hurt and anger, not instead of that processing. Positive thinking that acknowledges difficulty while choosing hopeful interpretation, not denial that difficulty exists or shaming yourself for noticing problems. The key distinction is whether the practice increases capacity to be with full range of human experience or narrows what's acceptable to feel and express. Genuine practice creates more internal space, more flexibility, more ability to be with whatever arises. Bypassing creates less space while maintaining appearance of expansion. Journaling helps track the pattern honestly. When you notice yourself reaching for spiritual concepts or language, pause and ask what you might be avoiding. If you're focusing on everything happening for a reason, what feeling might you be not wanting to feel? Powerlessness, grief, rage at injustice. If you're emphasizing forgiveness, have you actually acknowledged how hurt or angry you are? Or are you skipping to forgiveness because anger feels unspiritual? If you're talking about raising your vibration or choosing different thoughts, are you pathologizing legitimate grief, anxiety, or dissatisfaction that actually needs attention rather than transcendence? The practice isn't abandoning spiritual frameworks, but using them honestly, noticing when they serve growth versus when they serve avoidance. After identifying what's being avoided, the work involves deliberately turning toward it. If you've been using gratitude to avoid acknowledging dissatisfaction with your life, spend time with the dissatisfaction without immediately trying to fix or transcend it. What's actually wrong? What needs to change? What would addressing it require that feels difficult or threatening? Another practice involves checking whether your spiritual identity allows for full humanity. Can you admit to feeling petty, jealous, confused, or stuck without immediately interpreting those as spiritual failures requiring correction? Can you ask for help without framing it as a test, lesson, or opportunity for growth? Can you be wrong, make mistakes, or regress without it threatening your fundamental sense of worth? If spiritual identity requires maintaining image of constant growth, elevation, and transcendence, it's functioning as defense rather than authentic practice. Work involves deliberately revealing the messy parts to yourself first, then gradually to others, and noticing whether your worth and belonging remain intact when you're not performing spirituality. This might mean admitting you're angry instead of claiming you've transcended anger. It might mean acknowledging you don't know or understand instead of defaulting to spiritual explanations that sound wise but bypass actual confusion. Boundary work addresses the compassion without limits pattern directly. If you've been using spiritual concepts to justify poor boundaries, practice saying no to requests, even when you could technically accommodate them, even when the person asking really needs help. Notice the guilt and the narrative that says no is unspiritual, unloving, selfish, or evidence you're not truly compassionate. Recognize that sustainable compassion requires boundaries, that you can't serve authentically from depletion, and that teaching others they can take endlessly from you without reciprocity doesn't actually serve anyone. The work isn't becoming selfish or uncaring. It's integrating healthy self-protection into spiritual practice, rather than seeing them as contradictory. Compassion includes self-compassion. Service includes serving your own well-being. These aren't spiritual compromises or failures. They're requirements for sustainable practice that doesn't end in burnout, resentment, and collapse. The fourth practice involves grounding spiritual concepts in practical life and examining results honestly. If you're focused on manifestation and law of attraction, what concrete actions are you taking toward goals beyond visualization and affirmation? If you're practicing non-attachment, can you still engage fully with what matters to you? Or has non-attachment become not caring about anything? If you're working on presence and mindfulness, does it include presence with difficult emotions and practical responsibilities, or only presence during meditation? Spiritual practice should enhance capacity to engage skillfully with life, not provide escape from it. Check whether your practice makes you more available for genuine connection with others, more capable of handling challenges and responsibilities, more integrated and whole as a person, or whether it's creating increasing distance between you and actual lived experience. The test isn't how long you meditate, how enlightened you sound, or how many spiritual experiences you've had. It's whether your relationships are becoming more authentic, whether you're more able to handle life's demands, whether you're more at peace with being imperfectly human. Integration means recognizing spiritual practice and psychological work aren't contradictory but complementary aspects of whole human development. Meditation supports therapy by building capacity to observe thoughts and feelings without being immediately overwhelmed or reactive. Therapy supports meditation by addressing trauma that makes sitting quietly with yourself intolerable, by healing wounds that keep pulling attention away from present moment. Spiritual concepts about acceptance and finding meaning become genuinely useful after emotional processing, not instead of that processing. The goal isn't choosing between being spiritual and being human, but inhabiting both fully, accessing spiritual perspective and practices while remaining grounded in human experience with all its messiness, limitations, vulnerability, and need for practical healing work. Someone can meditate daily and go to therapy weekly. Someone can believe in higher consciousness and acknowledge they need medication for depression or anxiety. Someone can pursue enlightenment and still work on attachment patterns with a therapist. These aren't contradictions or spiritual failures. They're integration, the messy, authentic work of being human while engaging spiritual practice. The person who meditates daily yet remains deeply unhappy has options once they understand this framework. They can ask whether their practice serves genuine transformation or sophisticated avoidance. They can examine which emotions and experiences are allowed in their spiritual framework versus which get pathologized as insufficiently evolved. They can notice whether relationships are becoming more authentic and nourishing or more performative and isolating. And they can recognize that admitting to struggle, seeking therapy or other practical help, acknowledging difficult emotions like anger or grief, and setting boundaries don't represent spiritual failure. They represent integration, the willingness to be fully human while engaging in spiritual practice, rather than using spirituality to escape the inconvenient, uncomfortable reality of being human. The shadow of spirituality isn't that the practices themselves are false or harmful. It's that they can be used, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid the very psychological and emotional work they're actually meant to support. The light casts shadow necessarily. Recognizing that shadow and working with it honestly is itself genuine spiritual practice, perhaps more authentic than maintaining the carefully constructed image of having transcended what you've actually just hidden more carefully behind spiritual language and concepts.